All right, we are entering our last section of the year, 8.6, which is solving our rational equations and inequalities. So we're going to put together a lot of the different information that we have learned over the course of this chapter. So rational equation just has to have a rational expression in it, so a fraction in it. And we're going to also deal with inequalities today. So when we deal with these rational inequalities or rational expressions or equations, we need to first find out what is the common denominator, because all of these have addition and subtraction to deal with. And the suggestion would be to find a common denominator for both sides of the equations, all together, one single common denominator that would incorporate the whole thing. So in that case, when we look at the bottom of these fractions, I have 7, I have x minus 3, and I have 56. Remember, with 7 and 56, we need to use factor trees or some other method to find out a number that the smallest number that both of those can go into. So if you use factor trees, 56 would be 8 and 7, 2 and 4, 2 and 2. So 56 is representative of 2 times 2 times 2 times 7. And then, of course, 7 is as far as it can go, and x minus 3 is as far as it can go. So your LCD is equal to, which one has the most amount of 7s? Well, they've got an equal amount. The most amount of 2s, there's 3 of them, and the most amount of x minus 3s. This is the first time that we've really had a combination of something that uses factor trees and something that might need to be factored in the same kind of problem. So our LCD simplified would just be 56 times x minus 3. So that LCD has to be incorporated all the way across. So in this first denominator, I have a 7. That means that I need to multiply the top and the bottom of that by the 2 to the third times the x minus 3. So I have 4 sevenths, and I'm going to multiply it by 2 to the third, which is 8, times x minus 3 on top and bottom. The next denominator was 3 over x minus 3. So it had the x minus 3 already, but it doesn't have the 56. So we're going to multiply it by the 56 on top and bottom. And finally, 53 over 56. It already has the 56. It's missing the x minus 3. So each of these denominators I should be able to check and multiply them out, and they should all equal what my common denominator was. 56 times x minus 3, 56 times x minus 3, and 7 times 8 is 56 times x minus 3. So I know that I've done this part right. So let's go ahead and start simplifying. I have 8 times 4, which is 32, times x minus 3, plus 3 times 56, which is 168. And then 53 can be distributed into here to 53x minus 53 times 3 is 159. And this whole denominator becomes 56 times x minus 3. This whole denominator becomes 56 times x minus 3. This looks a whole lot now like a proportion. A fraction equals a fraction. And if I wanted to get rid of the fractions, I would multiply by the denominators. Remember cross multiplication? 56 times x minus 3 times 56 times x minus 3. That cancels out my denominators. That leaves me with just whatever was up top. Now we did that on purpose. That's going to help us skip some steps in the coming problems. Because if you find the common denominator for all three parts, and you multiply it out for the common denominator for all three parts, you can ignore the denominators completely because they will always cancel out. So all that we are left with is this 32 distributed. So we have 32x minus 96 plus 168 equals 53 minus 159, which is a really simple equation that we've been solving since Algebra 1. So I'm going to give you a minute. Go ahead and complete solving this equation. I'm going to show you my steps so that you can check to make sure that you've done it right. So you should have gotten that x equals 11. And you can plug that in and make sure that it's right. The hardest part of this whole problem is that LCD process. So let's do it again with problem B. We're going to find the LCD. And when I look at this, I see that 2 doesn't have a denominator. So it's really over 1, which makes our lives pretty simple when we're finding the LCD. All of the denominators are factored as far as they can. So my LCD is just 3 and 2x plus 1. So when I look at the first fraction, it already has the 2x plus 1, but it does not have the 3. Now remember, we said that if we found the LCD for all three of them, I can ignore the denominators. I recommend that you at least double check that we're doing it right by multiplying, make sure that, yes, that is the common denominator, but you don't have to write them like we did over on this other problem because every single time they will all go away. So we're just focusing on the numerators. So the second one, it already has the 3, but it doesn't have the 2x plus 1. So I have 4 times 2x plus 1. And then the last denominator, it doesn't have any of my common denominator. So we got to multiply the whole thing out. 3, 2x plus 1. 3, 2x plus 1. And we're focusing only on the numerator. So 2 times 3 is 6 times 2x plus 1. So 3 times 10 is 30. Distribute your 4 inside. So I have 8x plus 4. Distribute the 6 inside. So I have 12x plus 6. So I'm going to give you a moment. Go ahead and finish solving this equation out. I'm going to show my steps so that you can check your answers. So we get that x is equal to 7. Take a look at C. Now I notice that all of my denominators are not completely factored, so I do need to factor this last denominator. Go ahead and pause the video, work through your factoring steps to make sure that you're factoring this correctly. So I have x plus 3 and x minus 2 as my factors. So when I go to set up my LCD, I have the most amount of x plus 3's is just 1. The most amount of x minus 2's is just 1. So my LCD is x plus 3 and x minus 2. So when I go to find what these denominators need to become common, I notice that the first one already has an x plus 3, so it needs an x minus 2. So I'm going to focus only on the numerator. 14 times x minus 2. The next denominator was missing an x minus 3. Sorry, an x plus 3. So I'm going to focus only on the numerator, 10 times x plus 3. And then the final denominator isn't missing anything, so I can leave it as just 122. Pause the video and finish solving out this problem and see if you get the same answer. You should have gotten that x equals 5. We're going to do one more equation before we jump into inequalities. So for D, I notice that the x squared minus 4 has not been factored out. So I need to factor it out to be x plus 2 and x minus 2. Remember, it follows that pattern. 2 perfect squares with the minus in the middle. And for my LCD, the most amount of x plus 2's any one of them has is just 1. The most amount of x minus 2's that either of them have is just 1. So my LCD is just x plus 2 and x minus 2. The first denominator already has an x plus 2, but it needs an x minus 2. So I have 5 times x minus 2, because we focus only on the numerators with equations, minus the second equation has x minus 2, but it needs an x plus 2. So minus 3 times x plus 2. And the final denominator doesn't need either the x plus 2 or the x minus 2. So it just remains as 12. Before you pause this video to solve this, I just want to make you remember you're going to be distributing a negative 3 all the way across. So pause the video and see if you get the same answer as I do. You should have gotten that x equals 14.
Okay, to solve this, we need to find a common denominator for all three denominators. So 5x, 6x, and 3. The common denominator for all three of those would be 30x. So to get 30x as my denominator, from 5x, I would need to multiply by 6. From 6x, I would need to multiply by 5. And from 30, I would need to multiply by both 10 and x. Remember, whatever you multiply by on the bottom, you must also multiply by on the top. So I get 18, 5, and 20x. That means that this denominator no longer matters. 18 plus 5 equals 20x. So 18 plus 5 gives me 23. And I can divide by 20 on both sides. So x is equal to 23 over 20. The common denominator needed to solve this problem would be 15y, because 5 and 3 both go into 15, and I have a maximum of 1y in any part of the denominator. So I'm going to go through and make all of the denominators 15y, and then decide what did I need to multiply by to get to that denominator. 3y times 5 gives me 15y. 5y times 3 gives me 15y. And finally, 3 times 5y gives me 15y. And whatever we do to the bottom, we must do to the top. So I have 5 times 4 is 20. 3 times 2 is 6. And 3 times 5y is 15y. Now I can concentrate on the numerators. So I have 20 plus 6 gives me 26. Divide by 15 on both sides. And y would equal 26 over 15.